Keanu Reeves rode a Norton Commando 1,300 miles from Toronto to Florida to hand-deliver a film script. River Phoenix's agent wouldn't forward it, and he trusted his motorcycle more than the post. The same bike appears in the finished film. That Norton came from a Birmingham factory that had won the first Isle of Man TT and built 60,000 Commandos, voted Machine of the Year 5 years running. Then the man charged with reviving the brand named 3 pension schemes after its most famous models: Dominator, Commando, Donington, and invested £11.5 million of 255 people's retirement savings, illegally, in his own failing company. When administrators arrived in January 2020, they found 69 motorcycles and 6 Aston Martins. One scheme member had died 3 months earlier without seeing a single penny. Today, the story continues in a Solihull industrial estate. An Indian company, £200 million invested, motorcycles built to the standard the name was supposed to represent. This is the story of a Birmingham toolmaker who died penniless, having built the fastest machines in the world, and of what was done to the name he left behind, not through competition. Through a man who learned, at £16 a week, that people who want to believe in something are the easiest people in the world to deceive. Chapter 1. The Gamekeeper's Castle. On the 29th of January, 2020, a team from the insolvency firm BDO drove through the gates of Donington Hall and parked in front of a Gothic revival mansion that an 18th century military hero had commissioned from one of Britain's finest architects. High-dress stonework, ancient oaks along the drive, 80 acres of deer park rolling away to the River Trent. In the pale January light it was, unambiguously, a castle. Stuart Garner had bought it in 2013 from the administrators of a failed airline, and he had made very sure that the motorcycle press knew it. The photo shoots were arranged carefully. Garner in faded jeans leaning against a Norton, the hall's mullioned windows behind him. Journalists filed appreciative copy about the marriage of British heritage and British manufacturing, the castle, the motorcycles, the man in the middle holding it all together. He made himself available. He was presentable. He could talk to people. He had understood since he was a teenager that this counted for more than most people assumed. What Lee Causer and his BDO colleagues found in the workshops behind the hall that January day told a different story. 69 motorcycles in various states of completion, 466 customers who had paid deposits for machines that had never been built, more than £3 million of their money gone. And pension records. 3 occupational schemes bearing the names Dominator 2012, Commando 2012, and Donington MC, in which 255 individuals had invested a combined £11.5 million of their retirement savings. Garner had been the sole trustee of all 3. He had invested every penny, illegally, in his own company. Then the company had failed. One of the victims was a man named Robert Dewar, who had transferred £155,000. Robert Dewar had multiple sclerosis. His daughter, Sally Holmes, had spent 3 years trying to withdraw his pension. Garner's correspondent spoke of timing. The scheme was fully invested, he explained. It simply took time to cash flow requests. There was nothing to worry about. Robert Dewar died in October 2019, 3 months before the administrators arrived. He never saw a penny. The man who had taken the money had started his working life at £16 a week as a gamekeeper on the grounds of a Georgian manor. He had later described that posting as a formative education in the habits of the wealthy and the ease with which they could be manipulated. He had worked as a share trader, as a fireworks seller. He had cultivated, with considerable skill, the appearance of a passionate British industrialist. He had been made a government export champion. He had accompanied Theresa May on a trade mission to China. He had 6 Aston Martins. He received, when the courts finally dealt with him, an 8-month suspended sentence. But to understand how a man could steal the Norton name, could hollow it out and use it as a vessel for fraud, you have to understand first what the name was worth, what had been built under it. What it meant to riders and engineers and to the women and men who had put their savings into schemes named after its greatest machines, because the name alone inspired the kind of trust that took a century to earn. You have to go back to 1898, to a cramped workshop in Bradford Street, Birmingham, where a 29-year-old toolmaker with a weak heart and very little money believed that if you built a machine well enough and raced it hard enough, the world would eventually notice. He was not wrong. He was simply too ill to profit from it. Chapter 2. Pa Norton's Dream. James Lansdowne Norton was born on the 8th of January, 1869 inches. Birmingham, the third of 5 children of a solidly middle-class Victorian family with strong religious convictions and no particular industrial dynasty behind them. Birmingham, in 1869, was already the city of 1,000 trades, a place of bewildering manufacturing density where jewellers worked above metal bashers and glassmakers, operated 2 streets from tool and die shops, where the small workshop and the artisan's bench were as central to the city's identity as any of the great Victorian factories rising elsewhere in the industrial Midlands. It was a city that rewarded, above all, practical skill and the willingness to work to tolerances tighter than anyone else would bother with. Norton rewarded it from childhood. By the time he was 10 or 11, accounts differ slightly, he had built a working model steam engine from scratch, not assembled from a kit. Built, sourced the materials, designed the components, put them together, made them function. It was the achievement of a child who understood mechanical principles in the way some children understand music, intuitively, physically, with a confidence that comes from somewhere deeper than instruction. He was apprenticed as a toolmaker in the jewellery trade, a training that embedded in him the standards of precision and finish that were the highest available in the city. In an industry where the difference between acceptable and excellent was measured in thousandths of an inch, he learned to care. He was deeply religious throughout his life. Not in the perfunctory manner of respectability, but with genuine daily conviction, a man who prayed, who believed, who held to a moral code as naturally as he held to engineering tolerances. Later, workers at his company, men who knew him in his middle years, described him as principled to the point of occasional impracticality, constitutionally unable to cut the corners that might have made him richer. There is something in this that makes his story harder to bear. A man of punctilious personal integrity who would have found it incomprehensible that his name would one day be attached to the theft of elderly pensioners' life savings. He built the monument that would be desecrated. He cannot be blamed for the desecration. In 1888, when he was 19, Norton contracted severe rheumatic fever. The disease was poorly understood, frequently fatal, and in the cases where it didn't kill its victims, it tended to leave lasting damage, particularly to the heart. Norton survived, but he was never entirely well afterward. The chronic ill health that would define his working life began here, in a Birmingham bedroom at 19, and it gave him the prematurely aged appearance that earned him his nickname among those who knew him, Pa Norton. He was a young man who looked like an old one, and he had the considered, patient quality of someone who has learned early that energy is finite and must be spent carefully. He started, as most Birmingham manufacturers of his era did, with bicycle components. His workshop produced parts and fittings for the cycling trade that boomed in the 1890s, and the Norton Manufacturing Company that he established at 320 Bradford Street in 1898, at the age of 29, was a small, respectable, entirely unremarkable enterprise of the kind that a practical man with mechanical skills and limited capital could build in the Birmingham of that era without attracting particular notice. He had a product. He had customers. He was not famous or rich or destined for anything that anyone watching him in 1898 would have predicted. What changed everything was the internal combustion engine. Norton had been watching the experimental motor vehicles beginning to appear on British roads with the focused attention of a man who understood mechanical possibility. In 1902, he built his first motorcycle, the Energet, powered by a 143cc French Clermont engine bought in and fitted to a reinforced bicycle frame. By the standards of what would eventually emerge from his workshops, it was rudimentary, a nail and string ancestor of the Commando, more bicycle than machine, the kind of contraption that breaks in spectacular and instructive ways. But it ran. And it ran quickly enough to reveal something, that the relationship between a skilled engine builder's standards of precision and the performance of a small machine on a road was direct, measurable, and repeatable. Build it better, and it went faster. This was a language Norton understood. By 1907, the company had moved from Bradford Street to a larger workshop at Derrett Bridge, and Norton had entered one of his machines in the first ever Isle of Man tourist trophy. The TT had been designed specifically to test production motorcycles under real road conditions, the mountain circuit of the Isle of Man, 37 miles of public roads, in weather that ranged from Mediterranean to Arctic in the space of an afternoon. It was exactly the kind of event that Norton believed in, not laboratory performance, not showroom promise, but actual machines proving themselves against one another on actual ground. His rider, Rem Fowler, crashed at a section of road called Devil's Elbow. Fowler remounted. He won the twin-cylinder class. It was the beginning of everything, and Norton must have known it. The TT victory was the launch. Attention followed, then orders, then growth. The company moved again, to Floodgate Street, and then again, after the Great War, to the address that would define Norton for the next 4 decades, 89 to 117 Bracebridge Street, in the Aston district of Birmingham. The Bracebridge Street works, dark brick, cramped by modern standards, pressed up against the industrial heartland of the city. The air carried the smell of cutting oil and hot metal, the low persistent clatter of valve trains and lathes, the particular sharp bite of exhaust fumes from engines being tested. The workforce numbered in the tens at first, then the hundreds. Test riders put the machines through their paces along Bracebridge Street itself, an informal proving ground that would horrify any contemporary safety inspector but that produced, in its haphazard way, machines with the mechanical confidence that comes from being genuinely used. But through all of it, Norton's fundamental problem was the same. He could build, he could not manage. He prioritized racing, always, instinctively, as a matter of deepest conviction, over financial prudence, because he understood that the racetrack was where reputations were made, and he wanted Norton's reputation above everything else. The business was perpetually underfunded, perpetually overextended, perpetually reliant on the patience of backers. In 1913, the company went into liquidation. It was rescued, as it would be rescued again and again throughout its history, by outside money, R.T. Shelley, who manufactured automotive accessories, and C.A. Vandervelde, from the electrical industry, who became the first chairman of the newly formed Norton Motors Limited, saw what Norton himself could not make financially viable. A company with exceptional engineering credentials and a racing record that was becoming genuinely remarkable. They invested, they stabilized, they gave Norton the platform to keep building. He was grateful, and he kept building, and he gave the company more and more of what they were buying. Victories. The Isle of Man TT became a Norton fixture. Junior and senior races, year after year, fell to the machines from Bracebridge Street. The name began to accumulate what no advertising budget could have purchased, genuine racing prestige earned on the hardest road circuit in the world against the best machines that Europe could produce. In 1922, Norton was diagnosed with terminal bowel cancer. He had just returned from a 3,000-mile motorcycle journey through South Africa. He was 53 years old and had been in indifferent health for 3 decades. The trip was characteristic of him. A man who knew his body was failing him, who chose to spend his remaining energy riding 3,000 miles of rough South African roads because he wanted to know what his machines could do at the outer limits of endurance. The cancer, when it came, was confirmation rather than surprise. He had perhaps 2 or 3 years. He spent them at the Isle of Man. His last public appearance was at the 1924 Senior TT. He arrived in a chair, one of those low folding chairs that get brought out for occasions when an old man can no longer stand but refuses to stay away. He was 55 and looked older. He watched from that chair as Norton won both the senior and the sidecar races, the fastest motorcycle company in the world on that particular afternoon. His machines ridden by the best riders in Britain, his name already beginning to accumulate the kind of legendary status that he himself had never quite believed in. He died on the 21st of April, 1925. His home was in Sampson Road, Birmingham. He was 56 years old. He died, by the accounts of those who knew him, with almost nothing in the way of financial assets. The man who had built Britain's most celebrated motorcycle company had made other people rich and left himself nothing. He had done extraordinary work and given it, by financial necessity, to other people to manage. He had created something that his own commercial instincts could not sustain, and the gap between what he built and what he kept widened every year he lived. The pattern was set before any of the industrial catastrophes that followed. It was embedded in the foundation. Brilliant engineering, financial ruin, rescue by outsiders. The names of the outsiders would change over the next 100 years. The structure of the story would not. Chapter 3. Riding on a Featherbed. Joe Craig was not a flamboyant man. In the era of the great racer engineers, men who could ride brilliantly and then retreat to the workshop to modify what they'd ridden, Craig sat at the more severe end of the spectrum. He was methodical, precise, and uninterested in things that didn't improve performance. He joined Norton as a development engineer in the early 1930s, and over the next 2 decades, he would become the single most important figure in the story of the Manx Norton. The purebred racing single that made the company's post-war TT dominance not just possible but inevitable. The machine Craig worked on had its origins in double overhead camshaft engines that Norton had been developing since the late 1920s. The technical logic was straightforward and demanding. 2 camshafts operating directly on the valves meant faster, more precise valve timing, and higher revs than the conventional pushrod arrangements that most manufacturers used. It was not a new idea, but making it work reliably and competitively on the mountain circuit of the Isle of Man, where mechanical failure was punished not by a pit lane but by a stone wall, required the kind of obsessive development work that Craig provided year after year through the 1930s. The result, in the 1947 production form that would be sold to privateer racers until 1962, was the Manx Norton. It was beautiful the way that purpose-built things are beautiful. Every component in its correct place, nothing redundant. The geometry of the frame and the architecture of the engine working together toward a single aim. Privateer racers across Britain and Europe bought Manx Nortons by the hundred and took them to circuits and hill climbs and road races. The machine's reputation was such that it remained competitive, genuinely, seriously competitive, against far more modern designs for years beyond what its technology should have allowed. But the Manx's great advantage wasn't the engine, it was what the Belfast brothers Rex and Cromie McCandless did to the chassis in 1950. The problem with racing motorcycles in the late 1940s was handling. Engines had been developing for decades, chassis had not kept pace. Machines that were fast in a straight line became alarming at speed through corners, wayward, nervous, demanding reflexes that no ordinary human being possessed in sufficient quantity. Norton's existing frames were not terrible, but they were not what the engine deserved. The McCandless brothers, who were engineers rather than racers, looked at the problem with the same cold precision that had characterized the best Norton engineering since James Norton had built his model steam engine as a child. Their solution was the featherbed frame. All welded Reynolds 531 steel tubing. A double-loop design with a short wheelbase and a low center of gravity, engineered to flex in the right places and resist flexion everywhere else. When Harold Daniel, who had lapped the TT circuit at over 90 miles per hour on the old frame, took the new machine out for the first time, he came back with the description that would become the most famous single sentence in the history of British motorcycle engineering. It was, he said, like riding on a featherbed. The handling advantage that the featherbed frame gave Norton was decisive enough to change the character of the world's most demanding road race. Norton won the senior TT every year from 1947 to 1954, 8 consecutive victories, a run that no manufacturer has come close to repeating. In the 1930s, before the war interrupted everything, the company had won 7 of 9 senior TTs between 1931 and 1939, and across all Grand Prix racing in that era had taken 78 victories from 92 starts. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. A small motorcycle company in Birmingham, operating in a cramped factory on a street in Aston, was winning at a rate that Italian and German manufacturers with far greater resources could not match. The man most associated with Norton's post-war supremacy was Geoffrey Ernest Duke. Jeff Duke arrived at Norton in 1950, a young man from St Helens in Lancashire, who had served his time as a dispatch rider with the Royal Corps of Signals and come away from it with a relationship to motorcycles that was precise and physical and utterly unlike the way most people rode. He was smooth. Not smooth in the casual sense of a man who made everything look easy, but smooth in the engineering sense, efficient, economical, with a precision of line through corners that reduced wasted movement to nothing. He was also, in a period when most racing riders wore whatever came to hand, scrupulously turned out. One-piece leathers, rather than the usual jacket and breeches combination, a look so distinctive that it helped establish the racing leathers as a cultural object rather than merely a practical one. In 1951, Duke won both the 350cc and 500cc World Championships in the same season, riding Norton singles. He was the first rider in history to win 2 world titles in a single year. He won the BBC Sportsman of the Year award. He was awarded the OBE. His name was known across Britain and the Commonwealth with an intimacy usually reserved for footballers and film stars, and 3 separate bends on the TT circuit were named after him, Dukes, a kind of geography as tribute that the island has never replicated for anyone else. The achievement was remarkable in isolation. In context, it was close to miraculous. The machines Duke was beating were Italian multi-cylinder bikes from MV Agusta and Gilera, 4-cylinder, 90 horsepower, purpose-designed racing hardware from manufacturers whose budgets and engineering resources dwarfed Norton's. Duke was beating them on a single-cylinder British engine mounted in a beautifully engineered but aerodynamically disadvantaged frame by outriding the power differential on every circuit that had corners. He was, in the original and most literal sense, a David beating Goliaths. And he was doing it from a factory on Bracebridge Street, Birmingham, where, in the quiet moments between seasons, the test riders still put the machines through their paces on a public road. The Bracebridge Street works at its peak in the early 1950s, employed perhaps 160 people, building the fastest race motorcycles in the world. The scale of the thing, measured against what it produced, was almost vertiginous. You walk through those gates and past the smell of cutting oil and hot metal and the persistent mechanical clatter of the machine shops, and somewhere in those cramped Victorian premises, men who knew what they were doing were making something that would humiliate the best Italian engineering on the best circuits in Europe on a Sunday afternoon. The world noticed. The name accumulated its second and third and fourth layers of meaning, not just a motorcycle but a statement. The unapproachable Norton. It was the company's own marketing slogan, used from the earliest years, and by the early 1950s it had stopped being boastful and become simply accurate. Then, in 1954, Norton withdrew from official Grand Prix racing. The decision was made under financial pressure, and it was characteristic of everything the British motorcycle industry would do over the next 20 years. Prioritize short-term cost savings over the long-term investment that might have sustained the company's competitive position. The official GP program was expensive. The wins were still coming, but the Italian manufacturers were catching up, were, in truth, already threatening to overtake. Maintaining Norton's racing edge would require serious investment in engine development, in aerodynamics, in the kind of factory program that a small Birmingham company with limited backing simply couldn't justify to its shareholders. So they stopped. Joe Craig retired. The factory team disbanded. Privateers continued to race Manx Nortons throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s on the machine's chassis and handling reputation, and they continued to win races, but the trajectory was set. The official research and development that might have kept Norton at the forefront of engine technology was no longer happening. The Italians, and then, with an industrial force that nobody in Birmingham had yet begun to properly imagine, the Japanese, would fill the vacuum. In 1962, the final 42 production Manx Nortons were built. The last ones left the factory in January 1963. The machine that had defined motorcycle racing for 15 years was simply discontinued, a final production run on a dying line. But the name still meant something. And there were engineers and designers, and one particular chairman with a deadline who believed they could translate what the name meant into something the road rider of 1967 would buy. Chapter 4. The Machine of the Year. Dennis Poor was not a sentimentalist. He was a racing driver turned industrialist who had built Manganese Bronze Holdings into a significant British manufacturing group. And when he acquired control of Norton Villiers in the mid-1960s, he did so with commercial purpose, rather than nostalgic affection. He wanted a return on his investment. He wanted a product that could compete in the marketplace. He also, to be fair to him, understood that the Norton name was the most valuable thing in his portfolio and that squandering it on a motorcycle that couldn't keep pace with the Japanese machines beginning to arrive on British showroom floors would be more expensive than developing a serious alternative. In 1967, Poor set a deadline. Norton would show a new motorcycle at the Earl's Court show that autumn, or it would not show one at all. The deadline was the kind of commercial ultimatum that occasionally produces extraordinary results by removing the option of delay. The engineering team had perhaps 8 months. The problem they were trying to solve was ancient by Norton's standards: vibration. The parallel twin engine that Norton had been building since Bert Hopwood's Dominator of 1949 was, at the displacements now being demanded by the market, almost intolerably rough. Both pistons rising and falling together, a 360-degree crankshaft arrangement created primary vibration that worsened with every increase in capacity. At 750 cc, it was bad enough to crack frames and shake the fillings loose from the teeth of anyone who rode at sustained speeds. It was the specific, grinding, physical unpleasantness of a machine that wanted to shake itself apart, and it was the single largest obstacle to Norton competing with the smoother, more refined Japanese alternatives arriving from Honda. The man who solved it was not one man but 3. Dr. Stefan Bauer, a former Rolls-Royce engineer, had joined Norton and understood the problem in structural terms. If the vibrating drivetrain couldn't be balanced, it had to be isolated. His insight was that the engine, gearbox, and rear suspension could be mounted as a single unit on rubber bushings, effectively floating the entire vibrating assembly within a frame that didn't vibrate with it. Bernard Hooper, the chief engineer, and his assistant Bob Trigg developed the practical engineering of the mounting system, a 3-point arrangement of rubber-isolated joints that the factory would eventually call Isolastic, though the name wouldn't appear in any marketing material until a decade later. The critical detail in Hooper and Trigg's solution was this: they mounted the swinging arm on the engine and gearbox plates, rather than on the frame. Engine, gearbox, and rear wheel moved as one unit. The vibration was contained within that unit. The frame, the forks, the handlebars, and the rider remained separate from it. The chain, rather than running between a vibrating sprocket and a stationary swing arm, ran between components that vibrated together and in sync, which meant it didn't jump or snatch under acceleration. It was, in retrospect, an act of engineering desperation that produced a work of engineering art. The machine that emerged for Earl's Court in 1967 was called the Commando. The design consultancy Wolf Olins contributed the distinctive one-piece seat and tail unit, giving it a silhouette that announced itself from across a showroom. It was named, deliberately, after the most combative word available, the Special Forces soldier, the covert operator, the man who went in where others couldn't follow. It weighed under 400 pounds. It made 58 horsepower. It was, at the throttle of someone who knew how to use it, fast enough to embarrass almost anything on a British road in 1967. And it handled with the composed confidence that the featherbed frame had established and the Commando's own architecture had inherited. Riding one was a physical experience unlike anything else available. Below approximately 3,000 revolutions per minute, the Isolastic system's isolation was imperfect. The whole machine juddered and buzzed, mirrors blurred to uselessness. The foot pegs transmitted a persistent vibration up through the rider's ankles and knees that felt like the first intimation of mechanical crisis. Then, above 3,000, something happened. The vibration vanished. Not reduced, vanished. In its place was an uncanny, turbine-smooth surge of acceleration that continued all the way to the red line without the harmonics that plagued every other big British twin. Cycle World magazine, in its 1968 first ride, described the sensation as being like turning up the rheostat on a giant electric motor. The sound remained, the deep layered thunder of an air-cooled parallel twin at full throttle, the exhaust note rich and physical, the clicking of pushrods and tappet clearances audible beneath it. The hot oil smell drifting back from the cylinder head, none of that was isolated. None of that was supposed to be isolated. The Commando was not trying to be a Honda. It was trying to be something faster and more alive than a Honda, something that delivered mechanical pleasure rather than mechanical invisibility. Motorcycle News named it Machine of the Year in 1968. And in 1969, and 1970, and 1971, and 1972, 1972. 5 consecutive years. No motorcycle, British or Japanese, has come close to matching that run before or since. Approximately 60,000 commandos were built over 10 years. Fastbacks and roadsters and interstates and high riders for the American market, racing derivatives with loud paint schemes. The final 850cc Mk3 with its electric start. The machine became the defining object of British cafe racer culture, the thing the rockers in the transport cafe wanted on the other side of the window, the machine that appeared in films and advertising and on the bedroom walls of teenagers who knew exactly what they wanted and exactly what it sounded like. Keanu Reeves was 17 years old and living in Toronto when he bought a 1973 Norton Commando 850. He was not yet the man who would make Point Break or Speed or The Matrix. He was a teenager with a Norton, which was something rather better in certain respects. In 1987, when he needed to deliver the script for My Own Private Idaho to River Phoenix in Florida, and Phoenix's agent refused to forward it, Reeves loaded the script onto the Norton and rode 1,300 miles. The same motorcycle appears in the finished film, a working prop that had already proved its worth before the cameras rolled. He still starts it regularly, it said, just to hear it breathe. 60,000 motorcycles. 5 consecutive awards. Cultural entrenchment so deep that 40 years after production ended, a man who had built one of the most famous film careers in Hollywood still owned his and still started it to listen to it think. This was what Stuart Garner bought in 2008. This was what the name was worth when he walked into those negotiations with £1 million of borrowed money and a very clear understanding that the right story, told to the right people, could make a legacy last forever. He was not wrong about that either. Chapter 5. The Death of British Iron. The Honda CB 750 arrived in British showrooms in 1969, and the men running the British motorcycle industry looked at it with the particular expression that people wear when they understand immediately and completely that something irreversible has just happened. It had 4 cylinders arranged in a row. It had an electric start, you pressed a button, and the engine ran, without the ritual of the kickstart, without the physical negotiation with compression that British parallel twins demanded. It had a front disc brake. It would reach 124 miles per hour. It cost less than most British alternatives. And it worked every time. Not most of the time. Not when the weather was right, and the choke was set correctly, and you'd remembered to clean the points. Every time. The Honda engineers had not invented anything that the British industry didn't understand. Inline 4-cylinder motorcycles were not new. Electric starters were not new. Disc brakes were not new. What Honda had done was engineer all of it to a standard of reliability so far above what British manufacturers had been delivering that the comparison was not a technical discussion but a verdict. Japanese industry had invested. British industry had not. The gap was the result. The British manufacturers understood this. What they lacked was the capital, the production infrastructure, and, critically, fatally, the boardroom conviction to do something about it. Instead, they retreated, model year by model year, into the segments of the market where the Japanese hadn't yet established dominance, and waited for the Japanese to follow them there. The Japanese always followed them there. By 1972, BSA and Triumph were losing £16 million a year. £16 million in 1972 was a number large enough to end conversations. The combined group had held over half the British motorcycle market at its peak, had exported machines to dozens of countries, had built the bikes that Brando rode and McQueen raced, and Steve Hislop would one day push to the limits of the possible. None of that heritage paid a single invoice. The losses were real and accelerating, and the Conservative government of Edward Heath was being asked to make a decision about whether British industry's sentimental value was worth propping up at the cost of public money. The answer, in July 1973, was a merger. Norton Villiers and BSA Triumph were combined into Norton Villiers Triumph, NVT, a consolidated entity that the government supported with a contribution of nearly £5 million. The logic was legible from a certain boardroom angle: rationalize production, eliminate duplication, achieve the economies of scale that individual companies couldn't reach. Dennis Poor became chairman. He was a practical man with a practical understanding of balance sheets And the balance sheets told him that the workforce would have to go. 3,000 of the NVT group's 4,500 workers received redundancy notices. 3,000. The Commando was still being built at that point. The Machine of the Year award had been won 5 times. There were orders. There were customers. There were people who rode Nortons and would continue riding them, and who were, at the moment Paul's reorganization began, unaware that the hands that had built their machines were being shown the door. But it was the announcement regarding Triumph's Meriden factory that produced the response that nobody in NVT's boardroom had fully anticipated. When Paul announced that Meriden would close, 1,700 of its workers occupied the plant and refused to leave. The sit-in lasted 18 months. 1,700 people. 18 months. In an era before social media, before the instant circulation of industrial disputes to a national audience, they held the factory with the stubborn conviction of people who had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. Tony Benn, Harold Wilson's industry secretary after Labour won the February 1974 general election, facilitated the Meriden Workers' Cooperative. The workers would run the plant themselves. It was the industrial policy equivalent of a net stretched under someone falling from a great height, not a solution, but a delay, a humanization of an outcome that was probably inevitable. The cooperative operated for 9 years, producing triumphs until 1983 before financial reality overtook it. But the sit-in itself had disrupted the parts supply to the rest of NVT, shutting down other factories in the Norton Villiers group, accelerating the very collapse that the workers were trying to resist. The Commando kept being built through all of it. The Mark III, the final variant, with its electric start and its 850cc engine, came off the line at the Wolverhampton factory with the same measured care that had characterised Norton production since Bracebridge Street. The last batch, approximately 1,500 machines, was completed in September and October 1977. The final Commando, whenever it was, left the factory floor to no ceremony, no documentation, no last-day photograph that anyone has since been able to verify. Lines just stop. They don't announce themselves. Norton Villiers' Triumph went into full liquidation in 1978. Andover Norton, the spares operation, built perhaps 30 more machines from the remaining stock, then that too was done. The unapproachable Norton had been approached. It had been overtaken. The factory that James Lansdowne Norton had built from a Birmingham toolmaker's bench, that had won the first TT, that had given Jeff Duke his world championships, that had produced 60,000 Commandos, was gone. The name remained. But names, unlike engineering departments, don't need wages, and don't need investment, and don't need anybody to actually make anything. The name waited. Chapter 6. The Zombie. Dennis Poor was not done with Norton. After the NVT liquidation, he retained control of what remained of the Norton operation and pursued the project that had been developing quietly through the 1970s. A Wankel rotary engine motorcycle. The rotary was a genuinely interesting idea. Smooth, compact, lacking the reciprocating masses that had made parallel twins vibrate themselves to pieces, theoretically capable of delivering the kind of uncanny refinement that British riders had been chasing since Hooper and Trigg designed the Isolastic system. Poor's company, Norton Motors, 1978 Limited, built approximately 350 Interpol, 2 machines for police forces, upright, purposeful, not beautiful, but functional in the way that police motorcycles are required to be functional above all other considerations. They worked. They accumulated mileage. A few police forces ran them for years. Poor died in February 1987. He had kept the name alive, and the rotary program alive, and the skeleton of the company alive, for a decade after the Commando production ended. The next person through the door had different plans. Philippe Leroux described himself as a businessman. He was South African by birth, Canadian by residence, and, according to the Department of Trade and Industry, which would eventually investigate him, something else entirely by practice. He arrived at Norton in 1987 with money and ambition and the stated intention of producing motorcycles rather than just retaining a name. He commissioned the Norton Classic, 100 air-cooled rotary machines at £6,000 each. He followed it with the Commander, a touring bike built around the rotary platform, and then, in 1990, the F1. The F1 was genuinely beautiful. A full fairing, a distinctive exhaust arrangement, A look that was completely of its moment, and yet unmistakably Norton. The kind of machine that, in a better timeline, might have re-established the brand's presence in the premium market. The DTI investigated LaRue for financial improprieties. Directors were convicted. Hundreds of shareholders lost their investments. The F1 never reached the production numbers promised. The name waited again. What happened next, though, before the creditors arrived, was this. A man called Brian Crichton took the rotary engine that Poor had developed and the LaRue era had kept in existence, and with minimal budget and extraordinary mechanical stubbornness, built a racing version that was genuinely, bewilderingly fast. He called it the NRS 588. Its displacement was irrelevant. What mattered was that it was a Norton. It was racing the Isle of Man TT, and it was being ridden by Steve Hislop. The 1992 Senior TT is, by the consensus of those who follow such things, the greatest TT race ever run. Steve Hislop was not widely known outside motorcycle racing circles, but he was understood by everyone inside them to be something exceptional. A Horwick-born Scotsman with a relationship to the TT circuit that bordered on the mystical, who read the roads at 170 miles per hour the way an accomplished reader reads text, not letter by letter, but in meaning-laden chunks, ahead of where the eye seemed to be. He was riding the Norton Rotary as a factory team rider, and the factory behind him was in the process of going bankrupt. There was no fallback position. There was no next year. Carl Fogarty, his rival that afternoon, was riding a Yamaha. Fogarty would later become the most decorated world superbike champion in the championship's history, a man of exceptional talent and considerable combativeness who understood very well that second place was first loser. He was not, by any measure, an easy man to beat. Hislop won by 4.4 seconds. When he came in, when the machines were cooling and the numbers confirmed and the result was real, Hislop said something that has been quoted many times since, but loses nothing from repetition. That at certain points in the race, approaching speeds of 180 miles per hour on roads that offered no margin for error, he had found himself thinking, for the first time in his racing life, that maybe victory wasn't as important as living. He had thought that, and then he had won anyway. It was the first time a British motorcycle had won the Senior TT since Mike Halewood in 1961, 31 years. The company that put it in the race was simultaneously being stripped apart by creditors. The achievement was real, and the context was impossible, and the two things existed together that afternoon, the way glory and ruin always exist together in the Norton story, cheek by jowl, inseparable. Hislop died in 2003 in a helicopter crash in Scotland. He was 41 years old. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, the Norton name passed through hands with the wearying regularity of a property that everyone believed had potential and nobody could unlock. Nelson Scalbania, a Canadian entrepreneur. Joe Seifert and Richard Negus in 1996. Luigi Aquilini and Norton Motors International in 1998. Each owner arrived with plans and departed with losses. The story accumulated the quality of recurring nightmare, the same dream, the same waking at the same point, the same darkness afterward. Then an American. Kenny Dreer was a motorcycle restorer based in Oregon who had been thinking about Norton for years. He acquired the name in 1999, funded by an investment banker from Boston named Ollie Kerm, and spent the next 7 years consolidating Norton trademarks across multiple territories and developing a prototype 961cc twin-cylinder motorcycle that was, by all accounts, a genuinely handsome piece of engineering. He spent approximately $12 million. $7 million of that went to attorneys. The trademark landscape that various previous owners had left in disarray was complex enough to keep legal departments occupied for years, and Dreer was too honest about the difficulty to gloss over what it was costing. By 2008, the prototype existed, the production plan existed, the financing did not. The Lehman Brothers collapse had removed the possibility of the investment round that would have taken the prototype into production, and Dreer, who had spent a decade and $12 million of someone else's money getting to this point, could not raise what was needed. In October 2008, Dreer sold the Norton brand, the trademarks, and what remained of the assets to a man from Derbyshire named Stuart Garner for approximately £1.2 million. Nobody in motorcycle journalism had heard of him. He was not a known name in the industry. He had not, as far as anyone could establish, previously been associated with motorcycle manufacturing at any level. He had simply appeared, with money and evident enthusiasm and a story about passion for British manufacturing that journalists found compelling, and bought one of the most storied names in the history of motorcycling. He was 40 years old. Chapter 7. The Toff in Faded Jeans. Stuart Garner was born in November 1968 inches. Derbyshire, the kind of Midlands county that produces, in roughly equal measure, people of great practical competence and people of great practical audacity. He left school at 16 without academic qualifications. By his own account, his adolescence was largely devoted to chasing girls, playing snooker, and riding motorcycles. He did not describe this as a disadvantage. His first job was as a gamekeeper at Fourmarker Hall, a Georgian manor house that operated as a preparatory school, at a wage of £16 a week. He later described the position as one of the best educations he ever received, not in gamekeeping, which he found unremarkable, but in the study of a particular class of person. The families who sent their children to schools like Fourmark Hall were, in Garner's assessment, easy to read and easier still to impress. They wanted to believe in things. They wanted quality, heritage, the sense that the money they were spending was attaching them to something lasting and real. If you presented yourself correctly, if you were presentable and could talk to people and understood what they needed to believe, you could get almost anything from them at almost any price. He moved through various subsequent occupations: share trading, fireworks, retailing, a range of commercial activities that required more front than capital. None of them are remembered with particular distinction. What Garner was developing across all of them was a core competence that had nothing to do with any specific industry and everything to do with the relationship between presentation and trust. He was very good at it. The £1.2 million with which Garner purchased the Norton brand in October 2008 did not, on examination, come from straightforwardly clean sources. The majority of it, approximately £990,000, was a loan from a company called Tudor Capital Management, run by two men named Andrew Meeson and Peter Bradley. In March 2013, Meeson and Bradley were convicted of a £5 million tax fraud. They had been claiming fictitious income tax repayments on pension contributions that had never existed. The loan they extended to Garner had come from those fraud proceeds. Garner was not charged with participating in the tax fraud and gave evidence for the prosecution at their trial. But the money that bought the Norton brand was money from convicted fraudsters. He kept this quiet. There was no reason to mention it, and every reason not to. What he acquired for his £1.2 million was this: the Norton trademark and brand rights, 4 shipping crates of motorcycle parts, 4 prototype motorcycles from the Dreer era, and, in a separate transaction that sat at the edges of the main acquisition and would cause its own specific problems later, a 50% share in Spondon Engineering, a legendary Derby frame-building company that had been involved in high-quality motorcycle chassis work for decades. Garner's precise rights over Spondon were contested almost from the beginning, and allegations would later emerge that he had used his share in a company he only half-owned as collateral for borrowings he was using to fund entirely different activities. But that came later. In October 2008, he had the crates and the prototypes and the name was everything. He set to work building a story. The early Norton motorcycles from the Garner era were produced in modest premises, a former textile factory in Donington on the Moors, then other leased industrial units. They were Commando 961S, parallel twins drawing directly on the Dreer prototype 961cc, with the visual language of the classic Commando translated into a contemporary machine with modern suspension and brakes. Limited editions: the 961 SE in a run of 200, then the Cafe Racer, then the Sport, prices starting at around £11,000. The market, which was and always had been a niche of enthusiasts rather than a mass-market proposition, responded with guarded interest. There were buyers. The machines were real. For approximately the first 3 years, the operation had the quality of a genuine, if very small, motorcycle manufacturer doing what it could with limited resources. Garner was simultaneously building something else entirely. He cultivated access to government with the patient diligence of a man who understood that official endorsement was worth more than any marketing budget. In 2011, Vince Cable's Department for Business, Innovation and Skills extended a £625,000 loan under the Enterprise Finance Guarantee Scheme to Norton Motorcycles. In 2015, George Osborne announced a £4 million government investment in the company at an event that allowed him to be photographed with motorcycles and to say things about British manufacturing. In 2016, a further £1.8 million followed. More than £5 million of public money, in total, flowing into a company that, as the Public Accounts Committee would later note, with the controlled fury of parliamentarians who do not wish to seem partisan, had received it without the kind of due diligence that might have uncovered what was actually happening inside it. Meg Hillier MP, who chaired that committee, described the government as having blindly poured millions into the business. It was not an unreasonable characterization. Garner had been very careful to be available for photographs and very careful about which figures he provided and which he did not. He was made a government export champion. In 2018, he accompanied Theresa May on a trade mission to China. Meanwhile, at Donington Hall, Garner had purchased the hall in March 2013 from International Airlines Group, which had inherited it as part of the BMI airline estate. The building had been commissioned in the 1790s by the architect William Wilkins for Francis Rawdon Hastings, 2nd Earl of Moira, and its history had been extravagant even by the standards of properties that age. It had housed German prisoners of war during the First World War, including one Gunther Plüschow, the only successful escapee from British captivity in either world conflict. It had been a military depot in the second. A refugee camp. Then the headquarters of British Midland Airways with 800 staff. Gothic revival. Stonework. 40,000 square feet. 80 acres of deer park. The motorcycles were not actually built in the hall. They were built in a converted office block called Hastings House, a former BMI call centre that sat behind the main building and had the aesthetic qualities of former call centres. But in the marketing materials and in the profiles that admiring journalists wrote over the following years, the hall was the story. Garner in faded jeans leaning against a Norton, mullioned windows behind him, the marriage of British heritage and British craft. The man who had brought a legendary marque back to the home it deserved. He gave journalists access, he was available, he was presentable, he could talk to people. The production numbers that Garner claimed, and the numbers that independent researchers have since been able to verify, tell different stories. In 2016, he claimed the factory was producing 15 to 20 motorcycles per week. A 2018 interview reported that about 1,000 hand-built motorbikes rolled out annually, and that the number was approaching 2,000. Superbike magazine, which had been methodically tracking the company for years, calculated total UK production across the entire Garner era at 802 units. Forum consensus among Norton owners and enthusiasts puts the total number of Commando, 961 seconds, ever built at roughly 2,500, over a run of approximately 10 years. When BDO arrived in January 2020, they found 69 motorcycles. The board of directors, throughout this period, changed with a frequency that one observer later summarized as a giant game of musical chairs. Directors arrived, assessed the situation, and resigned. The pattern was consistent enough that the exits themselves told a story. Experienced business people, seeing what was actually there behind the photo shoots and the castle and the government endorsements, choosing to remove their names from it. Pierre Terblanche, a respected designer who had worked at Moto Guzzi and Piaggio, joined in 2011 and was gone within a few years. John McGuinness, the 23-time TT winner, signed with Norton in 2018 to race the V4 RR Superbike at the Isle of Man. McGuinness experienced persistent reliability failures that prevented him from finishing races. He later publicly chased payment of salary that he alleged had not been made. He too was eventually gone. But the machine continued to move. The story continued to be told. The magazines continued to publish appreciative profiles of the beautiful hall and the passionate industrialist and the handcrafted British motorcycles being built in its shadow. The government continued to write checks. And in March 2012, almost 4 years before George Osborne arrived for his photography opportunity, Stuart Garner had done something else. He had registered 3 occupational pension schemes under the corporate umbrella of a company called Mankrupted Limited, sole director, sole shareholder, himself. He appointed himself sole trustee of each scheme. He named them the Dominator 2012 Pension Scheme, the Commando 2012 Pension Scheme, and the Donington MC Pension Scheme. He had used the names of Norton motorcycles, the names that represented everything the brand had earned over a century of engineering and racing, to name the instruments of what the pensions ombudsman would later find was dishonest dealing. The gamekeeper had come a long way from £16 a week. Chapter 8. Dominator, Commando, Donington. The architecture of the scheme was not complicated. What it required was not sophistication but nerve. The nerve to do something straightforwardly illegal in a domain that most people found impenetrable, banking on the assumption that the victims would not understand what had been done to them until it was far too late to matter. Between March and September 2012, Stuart Garner registered 3 occupational defined contribution pension schemes. The employer under each scheme was Mankrupted Limited, a company of which Garner was the sole director and sole shareholder. Garner appointed himself sole trustee of all 3. The administration of the schemes was handled by a company called T12 Administration, run by Andrew Meeson and Peter Bradley, the same 2 men who had provided the loan that funded Garner's original Norton purchase, and who were, at the time the pension schemes were being administered, under active investigation for the tax fraud, for which they would be convicted in March 2013. The names Garner chose for his schemes were Dominator 2012, Commando 2012, and Donington MC. He named them after Norton motorcycles. He named the instruments of the theft after the things that had made the brand worth stealing from. The recruitment of victims was handled by a man named Simon John Colfer, who operated under the false name Simon Davies and ran an online pension transfer advisory website. Colfer was a convicted fraudster. His previous convictions were a matter of record, but nothing in the regulatory architecture of 2012 made it impossible for him to approach pension holders and offer them advice about the management of their retirement savings. He contacted people by email and by telephone. He was persuasive and professionally presented, and he told the people he contacted something that was technically accurate in one narrow sense and catastrophically misleading in every other. That by transferring their pension into a small, self-administered scheme, they could access a tax-free cash lump sum of approximately 25% of the pension's total value. What he did not tell them was that drawing down a pension before the qualifying age triggers an income tax charge of between 40 and 55% of the amount taken. He did not tell them that this is called an unauthorized payment charge and that HMRC pursues it without sentiment. He did not tell them that the lump sum they were being offered would be substantially consumed by the tax liability it generated. He did not tell them that the remaining funds after the lump sum would be invested in preference shares in a motorcycle company owned by the scheme's trustee. He did not tell them that the legal maximum for employer-related investment in an occupational pension scheme was 5% of the fund's total assets. He did not tell them that what was being proposed was not a financial service, but a pension liberation fraud, illegal self-dealing in which Garner was the trustee, the employer, the investment manager, and the sole beneficiary of the company in which their savings would be placed. He told them about the lump sum. He told them there was a 5-year lock-in period. He told them there was a 5% annual return on the preference shares. Between April 2012 and December 2013, 255 individuals transferred pension assets into the 3 schemes. Some were in poor health. Some were approaching retirement and had no time left to recover from significant financial loss. Some were public sector workers, local authority employees, NHS staff, people whose working lives had been spent in reliable, modest employment with the expectation that the pension at the end of it would be the reward the work had earned. Some were self-employed tradespeople who had spent decades building funds that represented their only financial cushion. The total transferred was £11,543,517. The individual amounts ranged from modest sums to everything a person had saved over a working life. £170,000 was the largest single transfer. Individual investments of £50,000, £60,000, £80,000 were not unusual, These were not imprudent people who had taken reckless gambles with money they could afford to lose. They were people who had been approached, professionally and convincingly, by someone who knew exactly which words to use and exactly which facts to withhold. As sole trustee, Garner invested every penny in preference shares in Norton Motorcycle Holdings Limited, his company. 100% employer-related investment, against a legal maximum of 5%. No written investment advice obtained, no diversification, no oversight. The pensions regulator later established that Garner had written personally to scheme members promising the 5% annual return, citing Norton's order book and the government investment as evidence of the company's financial health. In March 2013, Meeson and Bradley were convicted at Leicester Crown Court of the £5 million tax fraud. Stuart Garner gave evidence for the prosecution. He sat in the witness box and told the court what he knew about their activities. Then he went back to Donington Hall. Then he kept accepting pension transfers. The money went into Norton's operating expenses, propping up a business that was losing money faster than motorcycles were leaving the factory. It paid the people behind the liberation scheme. Garner later purchased cryptocurrencies with some portion of it. There were cash withdrawals. By the time BDO examined the wreckage, the castle itself and the Priest House Hotel that Garner had also purchased in 2016, expanding his personal estate to 80 acres, had been acquired by a company whose capitalization derived, in part, from the retirement savings of local council workers. The 6 Aston Martins in the stable had a combined value of approximately £800,000. The 3 Range Rovers, the Jaguar F-Type. The fleet that waited in the outbuildings while 255 people waited for letters about timing. Robert Dewar had invested £155,891. He was a man who had worked hard, saved carefully, and been told something that made intuitive sense to someone who didn't know what an unauthorized payment charge was. When he signed the transfer documents, he was a healthy man, with a normal expectation of a future. Paul Finch had spent 27 years building yachts at Princess Yachts in Torquay, a specialist manufacturer in the premium maritime sector, the kind of skilled, patient, physical work that demands complete attention and delivers modest wages and a pension as its long-term reward. He was 52 years old when the truth began to emerge. He had multiple sclerosis. He had been expecting to retire early. He had transferred more than £100,000. Elizabeth Pitcairn was 55 years old and lived in Cowdenbeath, in Fife. She had worked for HBOS as a branch worker, the kind of bank employee whose daily working life involves the financial concerns of people in their community, who handles their accounts and processes their transactions and understands in a visceral, professional way what money means to ordinary people and what it means to lose it. She had transferred £56,000. She had asked for it back a year before the company collapsed. One victim who gave evidence to the parliamentary inquiry preferred to remain anonymous. He had spent 30 years managing waste services for a local authority, public sector employment of the kind that defines certain working lives in certain communities, reliable and unspectacular and honourable. He had lost his pension. He had also received, on top of the loss, a substantial HMRC bill for the unauthorised payment charge on the lump sum he had received and spent. He had taken out family loans to pay a tax bill generated by a fraud he hadn't known was a fraud. He told the committee, "There are not enough years left to recover the funds lost. Any dreams of a retirement are gone." There were 255 stories like this. Simon Colfer was convicted of fraud in 2018. He received a sentence commensurate with what he had done. Garner was not charged with fraud. Chapter 9. Timing issues. The lock-in period was 5 years. The preference shares matured, in theory, after 5 years, and at that point, scheme members could withdraw their funds. This was the mechanism. It was also the period during which nobody could ask for their money and have any contractual basis for demanding it back, which was precisely why it had been structured that way. When the 5-year period began to expire in 2017, the letters started. Garner's correspondence to scheme members requesting withdrawals was a masterwork of the genre. It acknowledged the request. It expressed understanding. It explained, with apparent patience and even occasional warmth, that the scheme was fully invested, that all the capital was in Norton's preference shares, and that liquidating those shares to fund withdrawals required Norton to generate the cash flow to buy them back. Norton was currently experiencing some cash flow constraints. This was a timing issue. It was simply a matter of when, not if. He would come back to them. He came back to them with more letters about timing. Robert Dewar's daughter, Sally Holmes, began trying to recover her father's money. In 2016, Robert Dewar had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The disease follows different courses in different people, but in Dewar's case, the trajectory was clear enough that financial security had become urgent rather than merely desirable. The £155,000 was not abstract retirement planning. It was the material that the family's remaining time together could be built from, if it could be recovered in time to spend it. Holmes wrote letters. She made phone calls. She engaged intermediaries. She received letters about timing in return. She escalated to the Financial Ombudsman Service. She escalated to the Pensions Ombudsman. In May 2019, the Pensions Ombudsman issued a formal order directing Garner to transfer the full value of Robert Dewar's pension to a nominated scheme within 21 days. The 21 days passed. Nothing happened. Holmes continued. 3 years of this. 3 years of letters and calls and formal orders and requests for updates and silences and more timing letters. 3 years of watching her father's health deteriorate while the money that might have eased the remaining time sat in preference shares in a company that was buying Aston Martins. When she later described it, to journalists, to parliamentary committees, to anyone who would listen, her language was quiet rather than theatrical, because the quiet was what was true. She just didn't know how he could live with himself. That was the sentence she kept returning to. Not because other words weren't available, but because that was the one that contained what she actually meant. How can you take that from people and sleep at night? She wanted to understand it. She never has. Robert Dewar died in October 2019. He was 69 years old. He had not received a penny of his £155,000. Paul Finch described what it felt like from the inside of the situation. He wasn't sleeping, he said, because of the stress and the worry. He had nothing. Nothing at all. The money had been his life. 27 years of life. 27 years of showing up to the boatyard and building things with his hands and setting aside what could be set aside so that the end of the working life would be dignified rather than desperate. He had multiple sclerosis. He had planned around an early retirement. He had planned carefully, or thought he had. Now there was nothing to plan around. The planning had been done inside a fraud. Elizabeth Pitcairn was more specific about the failure of the system that was supposed to prevent this. She was a woman who had worked in a bank. She understood that checks existed. She had assumed they worked. She sat with the knowledge of her £56,000 and the clarity that came from years of working with other people's money, and she asked the question that had no satisfactory answer. How is it, in this day and age with all the checks that are in place, that he can have my money, basically take my money, and not give it back, and there be no penalty? She asked it because she genuinely needed to know the answer. The answer, as it turned out, was complicated. The pensions regulator, for its part, was not inactive. In May 2019, it had appointed an independent trustee, Dalriada Trustees, to replace Garner across all 3 schemes. This was the regulatory mechanism for removing a trustee who had abused their position. Appoint someone competent and disinterested to manage the schemes in the members' interests. Dalriada took over. They found what was there to find. The process of unravelling the investments and pursuing recovery options began. But the investments were in a failing company. The failing company was running out of road. In November 2019, Stuart Garner launched a crowdfunding campaign on Crowdcube, seeking £1 million and citing an order backlog of £30 million and a pipeline of exciting developments. The campaign attracted scrutiny immediately, from motorcycle journalists who had been tracking the discrepancy between Garner's claimed production figures and the observable reality, from former employees who understood what the inside of the business actually looked like, and from pension scheme members who found the spectacle of a man they were suing for their life savings pitching for public investment somewhere between darkly comic and physically sickening. The campaign was withdrawn within a week. Garner announced that an anonymous investor had provided the $1 million privately. Nobody, by this point, believed him. He had been lying for years about production numbers. He had been lying for years about order books. He had been lying for years about the investments made with other people's pension savings. The lies had accumulated the specific weight that lies accumulate when they are repeated long enough. Not the dramatic weight of exposure, but the dull, heavy weight of a structure that has been supporting more than it was built to hold, that has been creaking and settling and tilting for years, and that is finally, visibly, going. HMRC had filed a winding-up petition over £300,000 of unpaid tax. January 2020 was coming. Chapter 10. The Castle Falls. On the 8th of January 2020, which was, by a coincidence, that nobody had planned and that added nothing useful to anyone's life, the 151st anniversary of James Lansdowne Norton's birth, Norton Motorcycles appeared in the insolvency court over its HMRC debt. On the 29th of January, the company entered administration. BDO was appointed. Lee Causer and Danny Dartnail were the administrators. Donington Hall Estates Limited and the Priest House Hotel were also placed in administration on the same day. The following morning, the 30th of January, The Guardian and ITV News published a joint investigation. Simon Goodley had been working the story for The Guardian. Joel Hills was ITV's business editor. Roger Willis of British Dealer News had first broken the pension story in the motorcycle trade press months earlier without attracting the mainstream attention the story deserved. What The Guardian and ITV published on the 30th was the full account. The schemes, the victims, the amounts, the names. 255 people. £11.5 million. The Aston Martins. The castle. The response was immediate and, in certain quarters, characterized by a specific shame. The shame of people who had been writing enthusiastic profiles of Garner and Norton for years, who had photographed the hall and described the motorcycles and used the words handcrafted and heritage and British manufacturing without asking the questions that might have produced less comfortable copy. What BDO found confirmed and exceeded the worst assessments. 69 motorcycles on the premises. 466 customers who had paid deposits totaling more than £3 million for machines that had never been built and would never be built from these materials by these people. The vehicle fleet. 6 Aston Martins, 3 Range Rovers, 1 Jaguar F-Type, combined value approximately £800,000, registered to the company. A personal loan of £160,000 that Garner had taken from Norton and not repaid. A loan of £324,000 to another of Garner's companies, written off as irrecoverable. The V4SS, Norton's flagship superbike at £44,000, the machine that represented everything Garner had claimed about the company's premium capabilities, had been subjected to a quality review by TVS Motor Company's engineers, who had taken one apart to understand what they were dealing with. They found 35 defects. 20 of them were safety critical. Oil hose failures, battery issues, leaking fuel tanks, substandard electrics, low-quality welds on the frame and swing arm. A machine that had been sold for £44,000, that had been certified and road legal, that had been ridden by customers on public roads, had welds that shouldn't have passed inspection and fuel systems that could fail. A stop ride notice went to every V4SS owner. Cases were referred to the Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency. Former employees, speaking to The Guardian and to ITV, alleged that Norton under Garner had stripped motorcycles returned for warranty service to use their components in building new machines to fulfill orders. You brought your bike back for repair, and the parts that came off it went into someone else's bike, because the supply chain couldn't provide new parts fast enough to meet both demands simultaneously. This was the company that the government had described as an export champion. This was the company that had been photographed with cabinet ministers. This was the company to which £5 million of public money had been directed without the due diligence that might have found the 69 motorcycles and the £300,000 of unpaid tax and the £11.5 million of stolen pension savings. Garner had gone. The administrators were counting what remained. The remarkable fact, which would not become fully apparent for another 2 years, was that Garner had never been arrested. Leicestershire police had investigated and taken no further action. He would eventually face criminal proceedings, but not for fraud. That charge, which the Pensions Ombudsman had found would have been justified by its finding that he had acted dishonestly and in breach of his duty of no conflict, was never brought. The pensions regulator assessed the available charges and determined that the strongest available case was breach of the employer-related investment rules, a strict liability offence, meaning that intent did not need to be proven. The maximum available sentence was 2 years. The man who had stolen £11.5 million of elderly people's retirement savings would be prosecuted for breaking a regulatory rule. His guilty plea was entered on the 7th of February 2022 at Derby Magistrates Court. But while the legal process moved at its characteristically glacial pace, something else was happening. Something that James Lansdowne Norton, watching from whatever vantage point dead engineers occupy, might have found bittersweet in exactly the way his own story had always been bittersweet. The name had found new owners. Chapter 11. The Indian Phoenix. BDO received 331 expressions of interest in the Norton motorcycle's assets. 331 organizations, ranging from earnest enthusiasts with insufficient capital to serious industrial groups with genuine resources, who looked at what remained of the brand, stripped of Donington Hall, stripped of the pension liabilities, stripped of Garner and his fleet and his castle, and saw something worth acquiring. 29 of them submitted formal bids. 8 were shortlisted. TVS Motor Company, headquartered in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, was founded in 1978. Its parent group, TVS Group, was established in 1911 by T.V. Sundaram Iyengar to run South India's first motorized bus service. The motor company was India's third largest motorcycle manufacturer by volume, selling 4.75 million units in the financial year 2024 to 25. It made the Apache and the Jupiter and the iQube electric. It manufactured BMW's G310 series under a collaboration agreement. It was in 80 countries. Its market capitalization was $19 billion. The acquisition of Norton was led by Sudarshan Venu, then the joint managing director and subsequently the chairman and managing director of TVS Motor Company. He was 31 years old when the deal completed. He is the grandson of the company's founder, the son of Venu Srinivasan, who had built TVS Motor into what it was and who had received the Padma Shri in recognition of his contribution to Indian industry. Sudarshan Venu had grown up inside a manufacturing dynasty with a deep institutional understanding of what a brand's engineering heritage was worth and what destroyed it. On the 17th of April, 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic that had closed factories and grounded aircraft, and removed the possibility of the kind of ceremonial handover that such moments usually receive, TVS Motor Company completed the acquisition of Norton motorcycles for £16 million, paid in cash through a subsidiary called Project 303 Bidco Limited. Metrobank, which was owed approximately £7 million as the secured creditor, was repaid in full. The decision that defined everything that followed was the decision about where to build the motorcycles. It would have been straightforward and considerably cheaper to move production to India. TVS had the factories, the workforce, the supply chains, the manufacturing infrastructure. Norton could have become an Indian-manufactured motorcycle with a British badge, which is a perfectly legitimate commercial model used by many brands in many industries. Nobody of legal standing could have prevented it. The brand's heritage would have been preserved in the marketing, while the physical reality of production moved 12,000 kilometers east. TVS chose not to do this. John Russell, the interim chief executive appointed to stabilize the company immediately after acquisition, spent his first year rebuilding the basics, the financial controls, the workforce management, the supply chain relationships that Garner had left in various states of dysfunction. The decision about where to put the factory was taken early and held consistently. Norton motorcycles would be manufactured in Britain. In November 2021, production began at Solar Park, Monkspath, Solihull, an industrial estate in the West Midlands that shared its postcode with distribution warehouses and freight forwarding companies and food logistics operations, 75,000 square feet. Modern production infrastructure, 3-dimensional measurement equipment, a reception area with 55 classic Norton motorcycles spanning a century of production, running from machines that James Lansdowne Norton had built at Bracebridge Street to the final commandos of 1977. State-of-the-art alongside history in an industrial estate among the anonymous buildings that British manufacturing actually inhabits when it is working rather than posing for photographs. TVS committed £100 million initially. By September 2025, the total investment had passed $200 million. The work of inheriting Garner's legacy was brutal. Robert Henschel, who became chief executive in May 2021, came from a background in Valmet Automotive and Ricardo and Lotus Engineering, a man whose professional life had been spent in the serious end of vehicle development, where things that fail in predictable ways under controlled conditions are unacceptable, and things that fail in unpredictable ways at speed on public roads are something else entirely. When the TVS engineering team took apart a V4SS and catalogued 35 defects, Henschel wrote personally to every V4SS owner. He could not, he told them, fully repair the Generation 1 machines. They were creditors of the old company. BDO was the appropriate contact. The 29 outstanding Commando 961 classic orders that Garner's administration had left unfulfilled were completed and delivered, at no additional cost to the customers who had been waiting for them. Approximately 130 legacy bikes in total were honoured. It cost money that TVS would never recover, and generated goodwill that could not be quantified. It was also simply the right thing to do, which is not always the primary consideration in corporate acquisitions, but was evidently a consideration here. Vittorio Ursuoli joined as Chief Technical Officer, arriving from Ferrari and Aprilia Racing with the kind of curriculum vitae that announced an intention to build motorcycles that could stand comparison with the best in Europe. Simon Skinner, who describes himself as the first employee of the new Norton motorcycles, became head of design. Jerry McGovern, who had spent his career at Jaguar Land Rover shaping the Range Rover into one of the most recognizable luxury vehicles in the world, provided creative direction. Brian Gillen, who had led research and development at MV Agusta, joined as Chief Technical Officer in the company's next evolution. The motorcycles that followed were not the work of a company making do. The V4 SV, a 1200cc V4, producing 185 brake horsepower at £44,000, was the same price point as the V4 SS it effectively replaced. But it was not the same motorcycle. The V4 CR Cafe Racer, limited to 200 units, was the first genuinely all-new motorcycle developed under TVS ownership, a statement about what Norton could be rather than what it had been, designed for people who understood the difference between heritage as performance and heritage as decoration. At the EICMA Motorcycle Show in Milan, in November 2025, Norton unveiled the Manx R, an all-new 1200cc V4 engine at 72 degrees, 206 brake horsepower, semi-active Marzocchi suspension, Brembo high pure brakes, carbon fiber wheels from BST. Named after the machine that Joe Craig had spent 2 decades developing on the Isle of Man, designed by Simon Skinner, with McGovern's creative involvement. Built at Solihull, for a production run beginning in the first half of 2026. The Manx name, the name that had defined Norton's racing identity from 1947 to 1962, the name under which Harold Daniel had said it was like riding on a featherbed, had returned. Alongside it, the Manx Naked Street Fighter, the Atlas Adventure Bike, and Atlas GT Tourer, both powered by a new 585cc parallel twin, to be manufactured in India at a price point that could bring Norton into a market it had never previously been able to reach. 6 models, 3 engine platforms, a factory in Solihull, and a manufacturing partner in Chennai. Over 200 designers and engineers working across Britain, Italy, and India. Andy Street, the mayor of the West Midlands, attended the Solihull opening with the particular satisfaction of a regional politician watching investment arrive. He said that the arrival of Norton's global headquarters in Solihull was a real vote of confidence in the region. He was right, in the specific sense that it was real rather than rhetorical. Real money, real buildings, real motorcycles, being made by real people on real shifts. The thing that had been built from nothing in 1898, that had been given away through financial necessity, that had been destroyed by Japanese competition and government bungling and corporate mismanagement and straightforward theft, was being built again. By an Indian company. In Solihull. In an industrial estate with no Gothic revival windows and no deer park and no Aston Martins in the stable. By a company that had done the uncomfortable and straightforward thing of simply investing the money. Chapter 12. 8 months. Suspended. On the 31st of March 2022, Stuart Garner appeared for sentencing at Derby Crown Court before Judge Nirmal Shant QC. He had pleaded guilty to 3 charges of breaching the employer-related investment rules. Not fraud, not theft, not dishonest dealing, despite the pensions ombudsman's finding, in June 2020, that he had acted dishonestly and in breach of his duty of no conflict, and its direction that he make restorative payments totaling approximately £14 million. The criminal charge was a strict liability regulatory offence. No evidence of intent was required to sustain it. The maximum available sentence was 2 years. Judge Shant sentenced Garner to 3 12-month terms to run concurrently. She then reduced the sentence to 8 months for his guilty plea. She then suspended it for 2 years. He was also disqualified from serving as a company director for 3 years and ordered to pay costs of £20,716. He walked out of Derby Crown Court. He did not go to prison. He has not spent a day in prison. The pensions regulator, which had evaluated fraud charges and determined that the employer-related investment breach was the strongest case available, noted that it had considered the full range of options. The decision not to bring fraud charges was, in its assessment, a prosecutorial judgment about what could be proven to the required criminal standard. It was not an assessment that fraud hadn't occurred. In May 2021, Garner had been declared personally bankrupt on the petition of Leicester City Council. When his bankruptcy was concluded, the amount recovered and available for distribution to the 255 people whose retirement savings he had taken was £36,400. £36,400 against £11.5 million transferred, against approximately £14 million owed with interest, against £160,000 he had borrowed personally from Norton and not repaid, against £5 million in government grants, against the accumulated compound interest on 27 years of a Princess Yacht's workers' wages, against the £155,000 that Robert Dewar had saved over a lifetime and never seen returned. The recovery rate was 0.4%. September 2023. The pensions regulator permanently prohibited Garner from ever acting as a pension trustee. A lifetime ban. He will never again be in a position to do to anyone else what he did to 255 people between 2012 and 2013. March 2024, the Fraud Compensation Fund, which exists to compensate victims of fraudulent activity against pension schemes, paid £9.4 million into the 3 schemes. By August 2024, individual payments began reaching victims. The total FCF payment was £9.8 million, roughly 85% of the principal transferred, leaving the question of 8 years of lost growth and the interest that would have accrued on savings properly managed entirely unaddressed. Some of the victims who received their compensation had been waiting for it for 8 years. Some had spent those 8 years without the retirement income they had expected and planned around. Some had developed health conditions that financial stress, by every reasonable clinical assessment, will have made worse. Some had died. Billy Wallace, who was 59 in 2024 when the compensation finally arrived, received £33,000. His fund should have been worth £60,000. He said, with the caution of a man who has learned not to trust good news until it has actually arrived, that he would believe it when he saw it in his own bank account. When it arrived, he said nothing further for the record. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said. The Parliamentary Work and Pensions Committee, chaired by Sir Stephen Timms, had been examining the regulatory failures that had allowed the fraud to occur and had left victims waiting years for resolution. The inquiry was cut short by the general election of May 2024 before a formal final report could be published. Sir Stephen published a summary letter. No formal conclusions were ever recorded. There is a particular kind of institutional silence that descends over these situations when the formal processes have concluded and the political moment has passed. It is not the silence of resolution. It is the silence of a system that has done what it could do within the limits of what it was designed to do, and has moved on to the next case, and has left behind it people who are still living the consequences. Stuart Garner lives. He serves no sentence. He is prohibited from being a pension trustee for the rest of his life. The man who died without seeing his pension returned does not live. His daughter still asks the question that the courts answered only partially. How do you do this to people and sleep at night? Chapter 13. Unapproachable. Walk through the gates at Solar Park, Monk's Path, Solihull, on a working day in 2025. And what you find is not what most people expect when they imagine a place where motorcycles with 200-year-old names and 200 horsepower engines are made by hand. It is an industrial estate. There is no visual drama. The surrounding buildings, house, logistics, companies and freight operations, and the unremarkable infrastructure of contemporary commerce. The Norton factory is the one with the heritage Nortons in the lobby. 55 machines arranged in the reception area, running from the earliest production era to the final commandos. A century of engineering compressed into a lobby the size of a large sitting room. People who have worked with these machines all their professional lives walk past them every morning. Inside, the production floor is precise and unhurried. Three-dimensional measurement equipment captures tolerances to fractions of a millimeter. Technicians place components with, as one visitor noted, the care of people building a motorcycle for themselves rather than for someone else. The line does not rush. A Norton V4 emerging from this factory in 2025 has been measured and tested and inspected at each stage of its assembly in a way that the machines built at Donington Hall, stripped for parts, built from warranty returns, stopped by safety notices, were not. The contrast is not incidental. It is the whole point. Brian Gillen, who spent years developing motorcycles at MV Agusta before joining Norton, understands what it means to build something at the intersection of engineering seriousness and emotional intensity. A motorcycle, at this price point, the V4 SV, at £44,000, the Manx R heading for a figure above that, is not purchased with detachment. It is purchased with the specific ardour of someone who has known what they wanted for a long time and is finally in a position to have it. Getting the engineering wrong is not merely a commercial failure, it is a betrayal of the person who trusted the name enough to spend £40,000 on it. Norton's original marketing slogan, the unapproachable Norton, was used from the earliest years of the company, first applied by James Lansdowne Norton himself to describe the racing record of his machines and the standard they set. The word meant something specific, that the gap between a Norton and its nearest competitor was wide enough that competition was effectively impossible. Not better, exactly, though the machines were often better. Unapproachable, at a remove that made measurement redundant. The slogan had not been used with full irony until Stuart Garner attached it to motorcycles built with substandard welds, issued stop-ride notices to their owners, and used the name of the pension schemes in which he had invested the retirement savings of the trusting and the vulnerable. The unapproachable Norton, a brand so unapproachable that even its trustee could not be brought to criminal account for the theft conducted in its name. The new models at EICMA in Milan in November 2025 were named the Manx and the Manx R. Sudarshan Venu attended the launch. He is 36 years old, the chairman and managing director of a company that had invested £200 million in a British motorcycle brand because TVS Motor Company institutionally believed that the gap between what Norton had been and what it could become was not something to be managed, but something to be crossed. Joe Craig spent 20 years developing the original Manx. The new Manx R has 206 brake horsepower from a 1200cc V4 and will be manufactured in Solihull from the first half of 2026. The name is not nostalgia. It is a statement of intent. This is what the machine is, and this is what the name still means, and the two things are the same thing again. The Atlas, named after another Norton model, announced alongside the Manx, will be manufactured in India, at a price point designed for a different market than the V4 range. 585cc parallel twin, adventure touring specification. 200 showrooms globally, expanding. The Norton name in countries and price brackets where it has never been available before. James Lansdowne Norton died penniless in 1,925 inches, a house in Birmingham, knowing that his machines were the fastest in the world, knowing that the company bearing his name was not really his to leave to anyone. The pattern he set: build something extraordinary, give it to outsiders to manage, watch them fail with it, ran through a century of the company's history like a seam of the wrong material through good stone. The TVS acquisition broke the pattern. Not through sentiment. Not through heritage tourism or the retail of nostalgia or the kind of brand revival that consists of attaching a famous name to products manufactured as cheaply as possible in jurisdictions as far as possible from the name's origin, through the specific and expensive choice to keep the manufacturing in Britain, through £200 million, through 55 classic Nortons in the lobby of an industrial estate in Solihull. There is a badge on the fuel tank of every motorcycle that leaves the Solihull factory. The Norton Oval, the word Norton in the script that James Lansdowne Norton established in 1898 in the workshop at Bradford Street, where a 29-year-old toolmaker with a weak heart and no money and more precision than the trade required built bicycle fittings and dreamed about speed. The badge has been on motorcycles that won the TT, that carried Jeff Duke to 2 world championships, that Keanu Reeves rode from Toronto to Florida. It has been on motorcycles with substandard welds, built from the stripped components of warranty returns, paid for with the pension savings of people who trusted a name they shouldn't have had any reason to distrust. It is on the Manx R. It will be on the Atlas. It will be on whatever Norton builds after those. The name has survived, as it survived the liquidation of 1913 and the liquidation of 1978. And the parade of owners who came and went and took what they could carry and left the rest for the next one. It has survived, this time, because a company from Tamil Nadu that manufactures 4.75 million motorcycles a year decided that the gap between what Norton had been and what it could be was worth crossing rather than managing. Whether that is a consolation for the people who were robbed depends entirely on what kind of consolation you are able to accept. Robert Dewar cannot accept any kind. His daughter still has his question. The courts have not answered it. No suspended sentence has answered it. No compensation fund payment, arriving years after the loss and partial in what it returned, has answered it. How do you take that from people? And sleep at night? The name that his savings were used to steal is being made unapproachable again in an industrial estate in Solihull by engineers who know the difference between what it should be and what it was. That is the ending the story has. It is not the ending anyone would have written for it. But Norton never had the ending anyone would have written for it. It had, from the first, the ending that came from building something extraordinary and handing it, decade by decade, to whoever arrived with money and a story. This time, the story is true.